Are these newfangled things any good?
So, Spelunker HD, it's a 3D remake of the 1983 platformer that came out for 8-bit computers, the most notable of them being the Atari version. It's not to be confused, and this is quite easily a way of being confused on the Switch, with Spelunky 1 or 2, which was also released recently. Spelunky, an indie title that came out much later than Spelunker, and was based roughly around the premise of Spelunker, but not quite. Slightly different kind of game, and nothing to do with Spelunker itself, which is what we're talking about today. Now, Spelunker HD Deluxe is the remake that first came out in 2009 on the PlayStation 3. It's also been released now on the Nintendo Switch, but is it worth checking out? Well, I've had a shot, I've had a chance to play it, and I've got to say, if you're a fan of retro gaming and you loved the game the first time around, you are definitely going to love this. But there is a caveat for those that have never played Spelunker. So let's talk about it. It's a side-scrolling platformer. You explore caves and you're trying to find some treasure and you're looking for things like ancient murals. The cool thing about this is that it has the original version. You can switch between the original and the modern version, modern being 2009 essentially, although this is the new version on the Switch. It's essentially the same game as the PS3 version. The original version is still surprisingly playable. In fact, both games are pretty much identical in the way they play, which I'm going to come on to in more detail in a minute. But there are some benefits to the original over the remade visuals. Now, the remade visuals I think are quite nice. I don't think they're quite 2021, but certainly I would say compared to the original, it's a huge step forward and makes the game much more immersive. However, there are a couple of times where I find it quite hard to see pitfalls, and with the original version it was much more clear because obviously there was a lot less to play with. They had to make things obvious. So I do think that is one element that might have been better in the remake, in that sometimes I find some of the pitfalls, some of the bits where you can fall into a cave or fall into a hole, slightly difficult to see. Little side note, I am colorblind and it could be to do with that, but I'm just warning you there. So those pitfalls are slightly irritating at times. Now, what I will say about this game, whichever version you are playing, this is not an easy game and you may be easily frustrated, particularly if you didn't play the original. You've got to remember, these games are based on the physics of the 80s versions, where if you fall off something, you die. Now, that might be a ledge where clearly in real life, if he fell off that ledge, at the most, he might have a sprained ankle. He isn't going to die. But in the game, you die. It is very, very precise with what you've got to do, and that can be frustrating. Having said that, if you are a fan of retro gaming, this will not be anything new. You'll be used to this, and I think you're going to love that element, that they haven't messed with that. They haven't tried to change it. So it depends on which way you look at it. I think for new gamers, it's not so good. For retro gamers that want that experience, I think it's a good thing. Now, in terms of what they've done with it, it is literally a reskin of the 1985 version on the NES and the Famicom. And as I mentioned, you can swap between the two of the versions, the original and the modernized version. They are, in terms of controls, pretty kind of unresponsive, to be honest, but that again is in keeping with the original, and it can be more frustrating than you wish. One of the most frustrating things I found was when I would try to jump somewhere and slightly mistime it, and maybe I might have skiffed my head off the roof, and that would be it for me. I'd be dead. Obviously that's fairly unrealistic, but when you play it in the original format with the original visuals, it kind of makes more sense. It's just slightly jarring having those problems from the 80s in terms of controls with a sort of 2000s visuals. So slightly frustrating. Another thing that I found quite difficult, you need to make it through 10 stages to unlock the next area. So if you lose your lives before that, the game doesn't actually save and you're back to square one. That is quite frustrating, and to be honest, probably a quality of life that could have been done without losing any of the integrity of the original, and it's brutally hard in my opinion. But then again, I'm not a great platformer. Even with the classics, I'm not particularly good. There are plenty of modes in this game. There's an adventure mode, which I think is very good. There's a championship mode, which offers another 100 stages, which is very, very cool. I think that this game certainly offers lots of ways to play Spelunker in whichever way you prefer. I have to say the level designs are fantastic, and I think as the original was fantastic, I think they've done a really good job with recreating those with modern day visuals. and either version, I think, I have to say, you can see why this is a classic of the early 80s. It's amazing what they did around about 1983 to 1985 with this one. You can play the game with 6 people online or via couch, but I didn't find any online games when I had a go. I did try and find it and wasn't able to connect with anyone. It is an unforgivingly difficult game, and the mechanics are particularly frustrating, I must admit, and many people might just wish that this game stayed in the 80s, but if you look at this from a modern perspective and you look at the history of this game and you are into retro games and looking at the history of gaming, I think you're going to like this title. And the one thing I will say is it has a real addictive quality to it. It makes you want to play one more time. It makes you want to have another go. I found myself, even though I was hugely frustrated, going, right, I'm going to do it one more time because I can get that little bit further. And it's a proper lesson in how games have changed over the years and how games in many ways have got easier, I think, if I'm being honest. I think when you go back to some of those classic games, they're difficult. So I think it is particularly difficult, but that is kind of part of the charm. If I have to sum this game up, it's not for everyone. It is not the game that you want to buy if you are a modern day gamer not interested in retro gaming at all. But if you want a bit of history done in a very, very cool way in a nice package, I think this is a really, really good option, and it definitely keeps the essence of the original whilst giving it a modern skin and a modern feel and some modern modes. Definitely worth checking out. Maybe I'd wait for a sale, and particularly recommended for retro gamers.